When the valet refused to park Susan's car, he had no idea that his life would change forever. How she responded to his racism would shock even the most seasoned individuals. But let's begin at the very start. Susan Woods, a car dealership owner and successful businesswoman, stood at the door of an upscale restaurant, watching as her black Mercedes-Benz perfectly pulled up to the valet. With her confident stride and stylish outfit, she attracted the gaze of passers-by. But that didn't matter to her. All she wanted was to relax after a long day at work. For a moment, she forgot about the daily stresses and pushed all thoughts aside. A young valet approached. James, around 25, looked at Susan with a dismissive air. He briefly noticed the expensive car, but his gaze lingered on the owner, as if assessing who she was and what she represented. A flicker of doubt and light mockery flashed in his eyes. "Is this your car?" he asked, not bothering to hide his displeasure. Susan nodded calmly. "Yes, it's my car." James frowned, and as though already deciding it wasn't worth his attention, continued, "You can't park cars like that here. Move it to the back lot." Her heart tightened. This wasn't just a refusal. It was an expression of subtle racism, an assumption that she couldn't afford the luxury of a car like that, based on nothing but her appearance. She wasn't prepared for it, but a feeling of determination stirred inside her. "I bought it at my dealership," Susan said coolly but firmly, almost repeating the manner she used with customers. "So I decide where to park it." James, looking at her with skepticism, smirked, not understanding who he was dealing with. Full of confidence, he responded, "All right, lady, don't worry. I'll park it for you." Susan didn't move. She felt her irritation grow. She was not the type to just accept things quietly. If there was a problem, she would solve it. "No, I'll park the car myself." Her voice sounded sharper than she'd expected. This wasn't just about asserting her independence. It was a decision. She wouldn't let herself be insulted. Without waiting for a response, Susan turned and walked into the restaurant, knowing that this was only the beginning. As soon as she stepped through the door, everything would change. A plan quickly formed in her mind. She needed to find something out, and she knew exactly how she was going to do it. James stood by the car, unaware that in a few days, this event would turn into not just an awkward situation, but a pivotal moment in his life. The next day, James went to work with a slight sense of pride. His colleagues at the valet desk were already discussing the previous day's encounter, and even though no one said it outright, he could tell that they were laughing at how he had gone off on the woman with the fancy car. His friends joked that he could now be the security guard for all those rich ladies. "You're lucky she didn't freak out," one of them laughed, pounding his fist on the table. "Rich people with their cars always get away with everything." James nervously chuckled. He hadn't even thought about the fact that his behavior might have been inappropriate, or that Susan might see it as racism. To him, she was just a woman who was too self-assured for her status, and the car was too expensive for her to park it like everyone else. At that moment, Susan decided to intervene. She arrived at the restaurant early, intending to speak to the manager personally, but before she could enter, she saw James standing by the parking area. He didn't notice her, continuing to laugh with his colleagues. Susan decided to give him a chance to understand who she was without revealing everything right away. She pulled up to the valet, but this time she wasn't going to stand aside. Steering her car a little to the side, she stepped out and walked straight up to James. "Hello," she said, now with a clear purpose. James turned toward her, a bit nervous, not immediately recognizing her. She smiled calmly and said, "I think we've met before. I'm the owner of the dealership, and yesterday you refused to park my car." James froze. Panic flickered across his face. He was beginning to realize that this woman was not who he had thought she was. It wasn't just a bad decision. It was a mistake, one that now stood before him. He tried to justify himself, but didn't know what to say. I didn't know that," his voice faltered. Susan calmly and coldly interrupted him. "This is your job, James, and I think you'll soon realize what went wrong, but I'm not going to tolerate this kind of treatment." Without waiting for an answer, she calmly entered the restaurant. James stood there, red-faced, trying to find words, but couldn't. His colleagues were still laughing, not understanding what had just happened. But now, he knew he had made a mistake. This wasn't just arrogance, it was something deeper. While Susan waited for her meeting with the manager, she decided to take control. She quickly dialed her lawyer's number and arranged for an investigation into the incident. The whole exchange had been recorded on camera, and the video of James refusing to park her car was already circulating online. This was just the beginning. The next day, James felt uncomfortable. His colleagues were still laughing, but now it seemed out of place. He knew he had done something wrong, but hadn't realized how deeply his actions could affect things. Susan was already taking action. That evening, she released a press statement detailing the valet's racial bias. The video of James refusing to park her car went viral. People rallied behind her, and social media discussions started to heat up. At the restaurant, James was called into a meeting with the manager. Everything had changed. His colleagues were no longer laughing, and he realized his mistake. A couple of days later, Susan came to the restaurant in person. Calmly but firmly, she told James, "This isn't just a mistake. This is a systemic issue, and I intend to change it. You need to understand that things like this don't go unnoticed." James realized his mistake and felt the weight of what he had done. It became clear to him that this wasn't just a work error, but a moment that could change much in his life. A few days later, the scandal reached its peak. The video of James refusing to park Susan's car continued to spread. Social media and news outlets became platforms for discussing racial bias in customer service. Susan received thousands of supportive messages, but she remained calm, knowing that her goal wasn't just public exposure, but real change. James, trying to cope with the aftermath, was again called into a meeting with the restaurant's management. He sat before the manager, feeling the pressure mount. This was no longer just a conversation. It was about his professional reputation. "We can't ignore public opinion, James. We have to respond," the manager said. Susan entered the room just as her name was being discussed. She calmly looked at James, and he felt his face turn red with shame. She walked up to the table and quietly said, "I don't want to punish you, James, but you need to understand that your behavior is not a mistake. It's a symptom of a much deeper issue. You have a chance to change something." Susan's words struck a deep chord with James. He realized that what he had done wasn't just the result of his own prejudices, but part of a system that allowed situations like this to happen. That same day, James wrote a public apology, which was immediately posted online. He admitted his mistake and promised to work on himself. It was an unexpected acknowledgement, and many began to discuss how important it was to recognize one's mistakes and change their views. Susan didn't insist on punishment. She knew that for James, the real lesson was understanding his own guilt and his desire to change. That was her victory, not in seeking revenge, but in changing someone's perception and behavior. That evening, Susan returned home. She knew that the fight against racism was a long process, but every small step in the right direction was important. She was no longer just a woman with an expensive car. Now, her voice was loud, and people were starting to listen.